"I was waiting for my son," the woman said eventually. "He said he'd be right back." Isabella nodded. Busy sons were common. She understood that kind of absence. She didn't ask questions. The rain continued outside, tapping against the window like it was counting time. Inside, something else was building. Not comfort, not relief, awareness. When they finished, Isabella stood and pushed the wheelchair back toward the door. The city had shifted. The rush of lunchtime was gone, replaced by a dull gray lull. Puddles reflected tall buildings like broken mirrors. They hadn't gone far when a familiar voice cut through the sound of rain. "Isabella." She froze. Her supervisor stood under the building's overhang, perfectly dry, phone in hand. His expression was calm, controlled, almost bored. "You didn't collect your things," he said. "I will," Isabella replied, "after I help her get somewhere safe." His eyes flicked to the wheelchair, then back to Isabella. "This isn't your problem anymore." "She was never a problem," Isabella said. "That's not the point," he replied. "You're still on company property, and this," he gestured vaguely at the scene, "looks bad." The words settled heavily. Looks bad, not as wrong, not as cruel, just inconvenient, risky. "I'm just making sure she's okay," Isabella said. He sighed like she was exhausting him. "You're creating liability. If she falls, if someone records this, do you understand what that means?" The woman shifted in her seat, confusion and fear crossing her face. "I can go," she said quickly. "I don't want to cause trouble." Isabella turned to her immediately. "You're not." "Yes, she is," the supervisor cut in. "And so are you." He pulled out his phone. "I'm calling security." The word landed wrong, heavy, final. Isabella felt the familiar tightening in her chest. She knew what that meant. Security didn't help. They moved people along. They erased problems efficiently, quietly. She positioned herself behind the wheelchair again, hands firm on the handles. Rain soaked her hair, ran down her face, blurred her vision. She didn't wipe it away. "No," she said. The supervisor stared at her. "Excuse me." "No," Isabella repeated. Her voice didn't shake this time. "You're not pushing her anywhere." A guard approached from the entrance, large and silent. His eyes moved from the supervisor to Isabella, then to the woman. He waited for instruction. "They need to leave," the supervisor said. The guard reached for the wheelchair. Isabella stepped forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shout. She simply stood there, body between the guard and the woman, rain-soaked and unyielding. "She's not something you drag out of the way," Isabella said. "She's a person." The guard hesitated, just long enough to show he understood, just long enough to make the moment dangerous. The supervisor's patience snapped. "That's enough," he said. "You're fired, effective immediately. Leave or I'll have them remove you." The city kept moving. Cars splashed through puddles. People passed without slowing. The moment hung there, unresolved, fragile. Isabella looked down at the woman in the wheelchair, then back at the building, then forward into the rain, into uncertainty. She turned the chair away. And somewhere behind them, unseen and unacknowledged, something far larger than either of them was beginning to pay attention. Isabella didn't look back when she pushed the wheelchair away from the building for the final time. Not because she felt brave and not because she felt proud, but because stopping would have meant standing still long enough for doubt to catch her. And doubt, she knew, was dangerous now. The rain followed them down the street, lighter than before but persistent, the kind that soaked slowly and thoroughly. It clung to the hems of Isabella's pants, seeped into her shoes, chilled her feet until each step sent a dull ache up her legs. The city looked unchanged, almost indifferent. Office lights glowed warmly behind glass walls. People hurried past under umbrellas, faces turned inward, sealed off from anything that might slow them down. Isabella felt the weight of everything she had lost settle into her body, not all at once but in layers. First came the exhaustion, then the fear, and beneath that, something heavier and harder to name. Her phone buzzed again. She didn't need to check it. She already knew what it would say. She could feel the countdown ticking inside her chest now, louder with every step. Rent was due. Hospital bills waited unopened on her kitchen table. Her mother's next treatment was scheduled sooner than she liked to think about. The numbers didn't care about intentions. They never did. They reached a quieter street where the buildings leaned closer together, brick faces darkened by years of rain. The wheelchair wheels rattled softly over uneven pavement. Isabella adjusted her grip, flexing her fingers when the skin began to burn. She welcomed the pain. It kept her present. "You're going to get sick," the woman said gently. Isabella exhaled, probably. There was no drama in the answer, just acceptance. Illness felt like a small risk compared to what she had already given up. They stopped beneath a narrow awning while Isabella checked her phone for directions. Water gathered along the screen edges, 2 blocks more. Then a ramp, older building, steep incline. She swallowed and nodded to herself. The ramp was worse than she expected. Isabella leaned forward, putting her weight into the push. Her calves screamed. Her breath shortened. The wheelchair resisted at every inch as if testing her commitment. She pushed anyway. There was no one behind her now to threaten or watch or judge. Only the woman in the chair and the quiet knowledge that quitting halfway would undo everything. At the top, Isabella paused, hands shaking, muscles burning. She guided the chair inside, into a dim lobby that smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something older beneath it. She locked the brakes and let her hands rest there a moment longer than necessary, as if letting go required permission. The woman reached into her bag. "I should give you something," she said. Isabella shook her head immediately. "No." The woman looked at her carefully as if reassessing everything she thought she understood. Then she nodded. "Then let me say this," she said quietly. "You didn't have to see me today, but you did." Isabella absorbed the words without reacting. Praise felt strange now, out of place. She stepped back, offered a small nod, and turned toward the door. The moment she stepped outside, the weight hit her. Not emotionally, physically. Her legs felt unsteady. Her shoulders sagged. The adrenaline that had carried her through confrontation and choice drained away all at once, leaving behind fatigue that settled deep into her bones. She leaned against the wall for just a second, just long enough to steady herself, then pushed off and kept walking. She didn't know where she was going yet. Home felt too small, too quiet. She needed movement, distance. She walked until her feet hurt, then a little farther. The rain thinned to mist. Her clothes dried unevenly, stiff and heavy. Her phone vibrated again. This time she answered. The voice on the other end was professional, clipped. The hospital, confirmation of outstanding balances, reminder of upcoming treatment, specific numbers, specific dates. Friday, 3 days away. "I understand," Isabella said. When the call ended, she stood there, phone still in her hand, mist settling on her shoulders. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Those things required energy she no longer had. Instead, she thought of the building, the glass doors, the way they had closed without resistance, the way policy had spoken louder than humanity. She thought of how easily she had been removed once she disrupted the flow. She realized then that what happened to her wasn't an exception. It was a pattern. She wasn't the first person to be pushed out for being inconvenient. She wouldn't be the last. Systems didn't need cruelty to function. They only needed compliance. Isabella started walking again, slower now, every step deliberate. The city lights flickered on as evening settled in. Everything looked ordinary again, as if nothing irreversible had happened. But she knew better. Somewhere in a place she couldn't see yet, consequences were moving, questions were forming, connections were tightening. And the most painful moment, the one that would expose everything, was still waiting just ahead. Inside, warmth rushed in. Safety. For a moment it felt like she'd done the right thing and that would be the end of it. It was. The lobby fell quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Eyes followed Isabella now, not with gratitude, with calculation. Her wet clothes, her uniform, the wheelchair, everything about her suddenly looked out of place against polished floors and glass walls. A voice cut through the air, sharp, controlled. "What is this?" Isabella turned slowly. Her supervisor stood a few steps away, dry, composed, already displeased. He looked at the woman in the chair, then at Isabella, then back again, like he was deciding which problem needed to be removed first. And in that moment, Isabella understood something cold and heavy. Helping her was only the beginning. The supervisor didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Authority clung to him effortlessly, the way warmth clung to the lobby and never reached the sidewalk outside. His gaze moved slowly, deliberately, as if cataloging damage. "This is not acceptable," he said. Isabella opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her heart was still racing from the rain, from the effort, from the sudden quiet pressing in around them. She stood between the wheelchair and the rest of the lobby without realizing she had chosen that position. She was stuck outside, Isabella said finally. Her voice came out steady even though she didn't feel steady at all. The rain was heavy, she couldn't move. "That's not our responsibility," he replied, already shaking his head. "You left your post. You brought an unauthorized person into the building." Unauthorized, the word landed hard. The elderly woman shrank slightly, her shoulders pulling inward as if she were trying to take up less space. Her fingers tightened around the armrests. "I'm sorry," she murmured. "I didn't mean to cause trouble." Isabella felt something twist in her chest. The apology wasn't for anything the woman had done wrong. It was reflex, a learned instinct. Isabella recognized it immediately. "No," Isabella said, turning toward her. "You didn't do anything wrong." But the supervisor was already gesturing toward the far end of the lobby. A security guard had noticed. He was walking closer now, his steps slow, cautious, like he was approaching something fragile or dangerous. "We can't have this here," the supervisor continued. "There are liability concerns, image concerns if someone records this." "So you'd rather send her back into the rain?" Isabella asked. The supervisor's jaw tightened. "I'd rather follow protocol." Protocol, policy. Words that sounded clean and neutral as if they carried no weight at all. Isabella glanced around the lobby. People had stopped pretending not to watch. Some stared openly now. Others pretended to check their phones. No one spoke. The security guard stopped beside the wheelchair. He hesitated just for a second. His eyes flicked to the woman's soaked coat, to Isabella's trembling hands, then back to the supervisor. "Sir," he asked quietly. "Please escort them out," the supervisor said. Escort, another clean word. The guard reached for the handles. Isabella stepped forward before she realized she was moving. She placed herself directly in front of the wheelchair, her back to the guard, her face to her supervisor. Her pulse thundered in her ears. Her hands shook, but she didn't lower them. "She's not trash," Isabella said. Her voice was low, controlled, but it carried. "You don't just move her out of the way because she makes people uncomfortable." The lobby froze. For a moment, no one moved. The rain streaked down the glass walls behind them, blurring the city into gray lines. The woman in the chair stared at Isabella, eyes wide, frightened, not of the rain anymore, but of what Isabella was risking for her. The supervisor's expression hardened. "You're out of line," he said. "Step aside." "No," Isabella replied. The word surprised her with its clarity. The guard shifted his weight. He looked uncertain now. This wasn't what he'd expected. This wasn't routine, and routines were what made moments like this easy. "You're making this worse," the supervisor snapped. "This building is not a shelter. You're violating policy." Isabella thought of the windows she cleaned every day. of the people who worked behind them, insulated from weather, from discomfort, from consequences. She thought of how quickly the building had swallowed her presence when she was useful, and how loudly it rejected her now that she was. "She's cold," Isabella said. "That's all, I just needed a few minutes." "There are no exceptions," the supervisor replied, "and you don't get to decide that." The words hit harder than she expected, not because they were cruel but because they were honest. She didn't get to decide. Not here, not in this space, not in this uniform. The guard cleared his throat. "Ma'am, we need to move." "No," Isabella said again, louder this time. She felt it then, the shift, the invisible line she had crossed without ceremony or permission, her job, her stability, her ability to pretend this was temporary. All of it felt suddenly fragile, like glass already cracked. The supervisor straightened his jacket, his voice returning to calm professionalism. "You're done here," he said, "effective immediately." The words landed cleanly, final, irreversible. Isabella didn't argue. She didn't cry. She turned toward the woman in the wheelchair instead, gently adjusting the thin jacket around her shoulders. "Come on," Isabella said softly, "let's go." As they moved toward the door, the warmth of the lobby faded behind them. The glass doors slid open. Rain rushed back in, and with it came the realization that this wasn't over. It was only escalating. The rain didn't let up when they stepped back outside. If anything, it felt heavier now, less like weather, more like pressure. It soaked into Isabella's clothes, weighed them down, turned every step into effort. The glass doors closed behind them with a quiet, indifferent sound, sealing warmth, order, and authority on the other side. No one followed. No one asked questions. The building returned to its routine as if nothing had happened. Isabella pushed the wheelchair forward, her hands firm on the handles, her jaw tight. The sidewalk sloped unevenly, puddles gathering in shallow dips that splashed against her shoes. The woman in the chair didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence carried the same apology Isabella had heard 1,000 times before. "I'm sorry I exist like this." They moved one block, then another. The farther they went, the clearer it became that Isabella was no longer just helping someone. She was carrying the consequences of a choice that couldn't be undone. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. She ignored it at first, then it vibrated again, and again. She already knew who it was, the hospital, the same number that had been calling more often lately, each ring heavier than the last. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Not now. Not while her hands were busy holding onto something real. The woman finally spoke. "You didn't have to do that." Isabella didn't slow down. "I know." The words weren't defensive. They were factual. This wasn't obligation. It wasn't heroism. It was something simpler and harder to explain. They reached a small grocery store on the corner. The awning sagged under the weight of rain, but it was shelter. Isabella guided the chair inside. Warm air wrapped around them, carrying the smell of bread and something simmering. The space was tight, ordinary, human. For a moment, it felt like they were safe. Isabella checked her wallet at the counter, counting bills she already knew were barely enough. She bought soup, 1 cup, 1 sandwich. She split it without hesitation, handing half to the woman across from her. They ate quietly, steam rising between them. The woman's hand still shook as she held the spoon. Isabella noticed how carefully she tried not to drip, not to spill, not to take up too much space. That carefulness felt familiar, too familiar. She did one small thing that day, and it cost her everything. On a cold, rain-soaked afternoon, a janitor made a choice no one noticed at first. No cameras, no applause, just a moment of compassion in a place ruled by silence, rules, and power. Minutes later, she was standing alone, job gone, future uncertain, wondering how helping someone in need could turn into punishment so fast. What she didn't know was that this single moment had already set something much bigger in motion, something that would expose how invisible some lives are, and how loudly injustice can echo when kindness is ignored. But here's the question that changes everything. Who really pays the price for doing the right thing? Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe to our channel Stories of Racism to witness real acts of kindness and powerful stories of truth. We share new stories every single day, and tomorrow's story is something you won't want to miss. Isabella Moore woke up before the alarm, the way she always did. Not because she wanted to, but because worry had a way of pulling her out of sleep before the day had even started. The room was still dark, the kind of dark that made time feel suspended. She lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet hum of the city outside her window, calculating the hours ahead in her head like she always did. Rent, groceries, the next hospital bill she hadn't opened yet. Her morning followed a rhythm she never questioned. Coffee brewed too weak. Shoes slipped on without sitting down. A jacket checked for loose buttons, not for warmth. She moved carefully as if any sudden motion might knock something fragile loose. By the time she stepped outside, the sky was already heavy with clouds, thick and gray, pressing down on the city like a warning no one bothered to read. Isabella worked as a janitor in a corporate office building downtown. It wasn't the job she dreamed of when she was younger, but dreams had a way of shrinking when responsibility showed up early. The building was all glass and polished floors, designed to reflect success without ever touching it. She knew which doors opened silently and which ones echoed, which hallways were watched, which ones people like her were expected to disappear from quickly. She kept her head down, always did. She knew the unspoken rules, where she could stand when she could speak, how invisible she needed to be to avoid trouble. Her uniform was clean but worn, the fabric softened by years of washing. Her hands told the story the rest of her life never did. Dry, cracked, always busy. Hands that cleaned messes no one wanted to admit existed. That morning felt ordinary in the most dangerous way. The kind of ordinary that makes you believe nothing will go wrong because nothing ever does. She clocked in, picked up her supplies, and moved from floor to floor like clockwork. People passed her without seeing her. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Laughter resumed once she left. It wasn't cruelty. It was something quieter, easier, habit. By midday, rain began to fall, sudden, heavy, relentless. It streaked down the windows Isabella was assigned to clean, blurring the city below into moving shadows. She worked higher than most people liked to look, focused on her strokes, on finishing before her break. From above, the street looked distant, safer that way. And then she noticed something that didn't belong. At first, she told herself someone else would handle it. Someone always did, or at least that's what people like to believe. She paused longer than she meant to, her grip tightening just slightly. A quiet discomfort settled in her chest, the kind she had learned not to ignore, but also not to act on. The rain grew louder, the building stayed warm, and somewhere below, a moment waited, balanced on a thin line between being seen and being forgotten. Isabella tried to shake the feeling and return to her routine. She told herself it wasn't her place to look down, not her job to notice what happened beyond the glass. That was how the building worked. Everything had a boundary, everything had a rule, and people like her survived by staying on the correct side of both. She dragged the squeegee across the window again, slower this time. The rain distorted everything below, turning people into hurried shapes and umbrellas into dark blots moving with purpose. The city didn't pause for weather. It never paused for anyone. Isabella glanced at the clock mounted on the far wall. Lunch hour. A time when most people escaped their desks. A time when she usually worked faster, eager to finish before anyone decided she was in the way. Her radio crackled briefly, then went silent. No instructions, no interruptions, just the steady sound of rain and her own breathing. She leaned forward slightly to clear a stubborn streak near the corner of the glass, and that's when she saw it clearly. A wheelchair. It sat at an awkward angle near the curb, half on the sidewalk, half too close to the street. One wheel caught wrong, twisted as if it had given up trying to move forward. Rain soaked the seat. The figure in it barely moved, just a slight tilt of the head, a small, uncertain lift of a hand that didn't quite become a wave. Isabella froze. Her first instinct was denial. Someone else would stop, someone always did. A passerby, a guard, anyone whose job description made it easier to act. She waited. Seconds stretched. People rushed past, shoulders hunched, eyes down, each one stepping carefully around the problem without acknowledging it. A familiar pressure filled her chest, not panic, recognition. She thought of hospital corridors that smelled too clean, of waiting rooms where time slowed until it hurt, of her mother apologizing for needing help as if weakness were something to be ashamed of. Isabella's hands tightened around the handle of her equipment. The rules she followed every day suddenly felt very loud in her head. Stay in your assigned area. Don't leave your post. Don't create risk. She looked back into the empty hallway behind her. No supervisor, no witnesses, just silence and policy written somewhere she'd never been allowed to read but always felt pressing against her back. The rain hit harder, drumming against the glass like it was insisting on something. The woman below shifted again, clearly struggling, clearly cold. Isabella felt the moment narrowing, closing in on her. This was the kind of moment people talked about later, usually starting with the words someone should have done something. Her heartbeat quickened. She knew what stepping away would cost. She also knew what staying still would mean for her, for the woman below, for the kind of person she would have to be afterward. Isabella set the squeegee down. She didn't do it dramatically. She didn't pause to justify herself. She just moved, fast, purposeful, as if hesitation itself were dangerous. Her boots hit the stairs hard as she descended, each step echoing louder than it should have in the quiet building. With every floor she passed, the weight of what she was about to do grew heavier, and still she didn't stop. Because somewhere between the rules and the rain, Isabella understood something clearly. This ordinary day was already breaking. The moment Isabella stepped outside, the rain swallowed her whole. It soaked through her jacket in seconds, cold and unforgiving, as if the city itself were testing her resolve. The noise was overwhelming, traffic hissing over wet pavement, horns blaring, footsteps rushing past without slowing. Everyone had somewhere to be. No one had time to notice a woman in a janitor's uniform kneeling beside a wheelchair. Up close, the elderly woman looked smaller than Isabella expected, fragile in a way that made the rain feel cruel. Her coat was too thin, her hands trembling as she tried to keep them steady on the armrests. The wheel was stuck hard in a crack in the sidewalk, twisted like it had been forced there and left behind. Isabella didn't think, she acted. She gripped the wheel and pulled. It didn't move. The rain made everything slick, her hands slipping, her breath catching as she tried again. A passerby glanced over, frowned briefly, then looked away. Another stepped around them as if they were an inconvenience placed in the middle of the street. When the wheel finally came free, Isabella felt a rush of relief, short-lived and fragile. She pushed the chair toward the building, guiding it carefully, shielding the woman from splashing cars. The revolving door slowed them down. Someone sighed loudly behind them. Someone else muttered about rules. The call came late in the afternoon, when the day had already wrung Isabella dry. An unfamiliar number lit up her phone. She almost ignored it. Every unfamiliar number lately felt like bad news dressed up as formality. But something about this one, its persistence, the way it rang again after she let it fall silent, made her answer. The voice on the other end was calm, polite, too controlled to be kind. She was asked to return to the office building. Not to work, not to collect belongings, to meet. No explanation, no apology, just a time, a room number, a tone that assumed she would come. By the time Isabella arrived, the rain had stopped, leaving the city washed and cold. The building looked exactly the same as it had that morning, clean, glowing, untouchable. The glass doors opened smoothly for her this time, no resistance, no warmth withheld. That almost hurt more. She stood outside the conference room for several long seconds before going in. Inside, the air felt different, heavier. The table was too long, the chairs too far apart. Men in tailored suits sat comfortably, folders arranged neatly in front of them, eyes sharp with expectation. They didn't rise when she entered. They didn't greet her by name. Isabella felt small in that moment, not because she lacked dignity, but because the room was designed to make her feel measurable, evaluated, contained. She realized then that this wasn't about what she had done. It was about what she had disrupted. The supervisor sat near the end of the table, expression neutral, almost relieved, as if authority had finally arrived to clean up a mess he couldn't handle alone. Someone slid a document toward her. Policy language, liability phrasing, carefully worded sentences that removed emotion entirely from the facts. Her termination was restated, firmly, officially. They talked about procedure, about optics, about risk management. Not once did they mention the woman in the wheelchair. Not once did they say the word human. Isabella listened, heart pounding, as her actions were reframed into violations, as kindness was reduced to misconduct, as the room collectively agreed that what she had done was unreasonable. Then one of the men spoke. He hadn't said anything until now. He sat at the far end of the table, posture relaxed, gaze steady. When he leaned forward, the room shifted. Attention moved toward him instinctively, like gravity had changed direction. He asked a single question. Not about policy. Not about liability. He asked why she stepped outside in the rain. The room went quiet. Isabella felt the weight of the moment pressed down on her chest. She understood suddenly that this was the edge, that everything she had endured, every choice she had made had led here. She could soften the truth, she could make it smaller, safer. Or she could say it out loud. And whatever she chose next would change everything. Isabella didn't answer right away. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, the kind of silence used to test people. She felt every eye in the room settle on her, not curious, not compassionate, but evaluative. They were waiting to see what version of herself she would offer, the apologetic one, the grateful one, the careful one who understood her place. She thought of the rain soaking through her jacket. She thought of the wheelchair stuck at the curb. She thought of the way everyone had looked away. I stepped outside, Isabella said slowly, because no one else did. The words didn't come out loud, they came out steady. A few of the men shifted in their chairs. One cleared his throat. The supervisor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The man at the far end of the table didn't interrupt. He watched her closely now, not with impatience but with something sharper, attention. She was cold, Isabella continued. She couldn't move, and people were walking past her like she was part of the sidewalk. Someone tried to interject. Isabella didn't stop. I know what the rules say, she said. I know what my job description says, but none of it explained why a person in danger was suddenly not anyone's responsibility. The supervisor leaned forward. This is not about responsibility, it's about procedure. No, Isabella replied. It's about who gets protected by procedure and who gets erased by it. The word erased landed hard. One of the men frowned. Another flipped a page in his folder as if searching for a counterargument written somewhere official. The room had expected remorse. It had prepared for compliance. What it wasn't prepared for was clarity. The man at the end of the table finally spoke again. Do you know who that woman was? Isabella shook her head. No. She matters, he said, not loudly, not emotionally, but the sentence carried weight like a door unlocking. He paused, then continued, She's my mother. The room changed instantly. It wasn't dramatic, there were no gasps, no sudden movements, but the shift was unmistakable. Spines straightened, pens stopped moving, eyes recalibrated. Isabella felt the air leave her lungs, not from shock but from the sudden realization of what this meant. Not relief, not victory. Exposure. The man stood, slowly. He didn't look at Isabella as he spoke next. He looked at everyone else. "She waited in the rain," he said, "because she trusted that someone would notice." No one spoke. "She's waited her whole life," he continued, "while people decided what was convenient, what was safe, what was manageable." He turned to the supervisor. "You said she was a liability." The supervisor opened his mouth, closed it again. "You said helping her looked bad," the man continued. "You called security, you threatened removal." He turned back to the table, "And all of you sat here ready to justify it." The room felt smaller now, the walls closer, the policies thinner. Isabella stood frozen, heart pounding, not knowing whether she was about to be vindicated or erased more thoroughly than before. The man finally looked at her. "You lost your job for doing what none of us were willing to do," he said. For a moment something flickered across his face, not anger, not pity. Recognition. "But that's not the worst part," he continued. "The worst part is that this didn't surprise anyone in this room." Silence pressed in again, heavier than before. Isabella realized then that this wasn't just about her, or his mother, or that building. This was about a system that functioned exactly as designed. And now it had been seen. The man took a breath, steadying himself. "This meeting isn't about reinstatement," he said. "It's about accountability." Isabella's pulse thundered. She felt like the floor beneath her might give way at any second. Because if accountability was truly coming, it wouldn't stop here. And nothing would be the same after what came next. The man did not sit back down. He remained standing at the end of the table, hands resting lightly on the polished surface, posture calm but unyielding, the kind of stillness that carried authority without needing to announce it. The room waited for him now, not out of respect, but out of necessity. Whatever happened next would move in only one direction. "Accountability," he repeated, letting the word settle, "is uncomfortable. That's why systems avoid it." He turned slightly, packing one slow step, then another. Each movement felt deliberate, as if he were giving the room time to understand that there would be no retreat, no reframing, no quiet exit from what had already been exposed. "My mother didn't need charity," he said. "She didn't need permission. She needed the same basic consideration everyone else in this building takes for granted." He stopped and faced them again. "And the only person who offered that," he continued, "was the one you dismissed as replaceable." Isabella felt her chest tighten. Replaceable. She had heard that word before, though no one had ever spoken it out loud. It lived in schedules and short-staffed shifts, in the way her absence would be filled before the end of the week, in the way no one had followed her out of the building when she was fired. The man turned to her again. His voice softened, not with pity but with gravity. "Do you know what it means to be invisible?" he asked. Isabella hesitated, then nodded, "Yes." He looked back at the others. "That's the problem," he said. "She knows it and you don't." One of the men finally spoke, his voice careful, practiced. "With all due respect, this situation was handled according to procedure," the man finished. "Yes, I know." He reached into his jacket and removed his phone, placing it on the table. He tapped the screen once, then again. Audio filled the room. Not loud, not distorted, clear. Isabella recognized the voice instantly. The supervisor. She heard him again saying liability, image concerns, we can't have this here. She heard herself saying she's not trash. She heard the word escort, the word remove. No one moved. No one breathed. The man let the recording play to the end. Then he turned the phone face down. "This," he said quietly, "is what happens when power forgets it's being watched." The supervisor's face drained of color. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked around the table, searching for anyone to intervene. No one did. Isabella felt something shift inside her then, not triumph, not relief, a strange, steady resolve. The moment had passed the point of spectacle. This was no longer about saving face. This was about consequence. "You fired her," the man said, looking directly at the supervisor now. "On the spot, in front of witnesses, for refusing to let my mother be pushed back into the rain." He paused. "You did exactly what the system trained you to do." The room waited for the verdict. "And that," the man continued, "is why the system needs to change." He straightened, finally stepping back from the table. "There will be an investigation," he said. "Not internal, independent. Every decision made today will be reviewed. Every policy cited will be questioned. Every person who stood silent will be asked why." Murmurs rippled through the room. Panic, thinly veiled. Careers flashing before eyes that had never imagined being on the wrong side of the glass. The man turned to Isabella one last time. "You didn't just help my mother," he said. "You revealed something the rest of us were trained not to see." Isabella swallowed. Her hands trembled not from fear now, but from the release of it. "And I won't pretend this makes everything right," he added. "It won't undo what you lost. It won't erase what you went through." He paused, letting honesty do its work. "But it will not be ignored." The meeting ended without ceremony. No applause, no apologies. People stood slowly, gathering their things with shaking hands, avoiding Isabella's eyes. The supervisor left first, quickly, smaller than she remembered him. Isabella remained, seated for a moment after the room emptied. She felt hollow, changed, as if something essential had been stripped away and something unmovable had taken its place. She understood now that this wasn't a rescue story. It was a reckoning. And while the worst moment had passed, the consequences were only beginning to unfold, far beyond that room, far beyond that building, into a world that would now have to decide what to do with the truth it could no longer unsee. When Isabella finally stepped out of the building, the city felt strangely quiet. Not silent, just subdued, as if everything had exhaled at once. The rain was gone now. The pavement still glistened, reflecting streetlights and passing headlights, but the air felt lighter, cooler. She stood there for a moment without moving, unsure what to do with her hands, her thoughts, her body. After days of tension, adrenaline, and restraint, stillness felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. She walked slowly, no destination in mind. Every step carried the weight of what had happened inside that room, not the confrontation itself, but the realization it had forced into the open, that what she had experienced wasn't rare. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an unfortunate coincidence. It was a pattern so common it had become invisible to the people protected by it. By the time Isabella reached her apartment, exhaustion had settled into her bones, the kind that sleep doesn't immediately touch. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it, finally allowing herself to breathe deeply. Her shoes were still damp. Her clothes smelled faintly of rain and city air. She didn't change right away. She stood there, eyes closed, letting the quiet press in. The next few days passed without ceremony. There were phone calls, emails, carefully worded messages from people who hadn't known her name before but now wanted to document her experience. She answered some, ignored others. Every conversation reopened the memory in a slightly different way. Each retelling felt like laying the same wound bare again and again for examination. Her mother asked how work was going. Isabella paused before answering, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she was deciding how much truth her mother could carry without guilt. She chose gentleness. She always did. "I'm figuring things out," she said. At night, she replayed the moment she stepped in front of the wheelchair, not with regret, with clarity. She understood now that the choice had reshaped her life in ways she couldn't yet measure. She had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Once you saw how easily people were dismissed, moved aside, erased, you couldn't unsee it. A week later, the story surfaced quietly, not as a headline, not as outrage, just enough attention to be uncomfortable for the people involved. Statements were released, policies were reviewed. Words like values and commitment appeared in emails written by people who had never stood in the rain. Isabella watched it all from a distance. She wasn't invited to speak at first. Then she was. She declined. Not because she didn't care, but because she understood something now that she hadn't before. Visibility wasn't the same as justice. Attention wasn't the same as accountability. What mattered most to her wasn't being seen. It was refusing to disappear again. She found work eventually, different, less polished, more honest. It didn't come with glass walls or silent elevators. It came with people who knew her name, who met her eyes, who didn't flinch when she took up space. The pay wasn't higher, the hours weren't easier, but the air felt different, safer. Sometimes she still thought about the building, about the way it looked from the outside, clean, modern, unbothered. She wondered how many other people passed through its doors every day carrying quiet burdens no one bothered to notice. How many choices were made in conference rooms that never considered the people affected by them. The memory of the woman in the wheelchair stayed with her most vividly, not the helplessness, but the dignity, the way she held herself, the way she listened, the way she spoke about being managed, moved, scheduled into invisibility. Isabella understood now that racism didn't always announce itself with cruelty. Sometimes it whispered through systems, through rules, through decisions that claimed neutrality while protecting comfort. And the hardest part was this. Most people participating in it believed they were doing nothing wrong. Isabella didn't feel victorious. She felt changed. She had learned that standing up didn't always look loud or triumphant. Sometimes it looked like loss. Sometimes it looked like uncertainty. Sometimes it looked like choosing to carry consequences rather than let someone else carry them alone. The world hadn't transformed overnight. Systems didn't crumble. Injustice didn't end. But something in Isabella had shifted permanently. She no longer measured her worth by how quietly she could move through spaces that were never built for her. She no longer mistook survival for safety, and she no longer believed that silence was neutral. The impact of what happened continued to ripple outward in ways she could see and many she couldn't. Conversations started in places that had never questioned themselves before. Some people listened, others resisted. Change was uneven, slow, incomplete. But it had begun. And for Isabella, that mattered. Time did what it always did after something irreversible. It kept moving, whether Isabella felt ready or not. Weeks passed, then months. The sharp edge of the moment softened, but it never disappeared. It settled into her life in quieter ways, surfacing when she least expected it, in the way she listened more closely now, in the way she noticed who was interrupted, who was overlooked, who was expected to apologize for taking up space. She had always sensed these things before, but now they had names, patterns, weight. People reached out to her, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily. Some were careful, almost afraid, as if acknowledging what happened might implicate them. Others were blunt, asking questions they had never asked themselves before. A few shared their own stories, hesitant at first, then spilling out as if they had been waiting years for permission to speak. Isabella learned quickly that pain recognized tends to multiply, not because it grows, but because it was always there, unseen. She heard from workers who had been disciplined for being too visible, from people who had followed rules perfectly and still found themselves disposable, from those who had learned early on that survival meant silence. Many of them didn't use the word racism. They didn't need to. The stories told it for them. And then there were the others, the ones who insisted the system worked, that exceptions proved fairness, that kindness was admirable but impractical. They spoke in the same careful language Isabella had heard in that conference room, words that sounded reasonable until you followed them to their conclusion. Isabella didn't argue with them anymore. She understood something now. Not everyone was ready to see what required them to change. Some people preferred explanations that kept their world intact. Others mistook comfort for truth. What surprised her most was how often people thanked her. Thanked her for being brave. Thanked her for standing up. Thanked her for speaking out. At first it made her uncomfortable. She hadn't felt brave. She had felt cornered, pushed, forced to choose between becoming someone she didn't recognize or losing something she couldn't afford to lose. The praise didn't erase the cost. It didn't pay the bills. It didn't undo the fear she felt walking home that night, unsure how she would explain everything to her mother. But over time, Isabella realized the gratitude wasn't really about her. It was about permission. For some people, her story cracked open a door they had kept shut for years. It gave them language, validation, proof that what they had felt wasn't imagined or exaggerated or isolated, that systems could harm without shouting, that injustice didn't always wear a villain's face. She began volunteering in small, unglamorous ways, not panels, not interviews, just showing up, listening, helping others navigate spaces that weren't built with them in mind. She didn't offer solutions. She offered presence, and sometimes that was enough. Her relationship with her mother changed too, subtly, but unmistakably. Isabella noticed how often her mother apologized now, and gently, firmly, she started pushing back. "You don't have to be sorry," she would say. "You're allowed to need help. You're allowed to take up space." At first her mother laughed it off, then she went quiet, then one night she cried. It was the first time Isabella understood how deeply these lessons traveled, how racism and inequality didn't just affect jobs or buildings or moments in the rain, but seeped into how people saw themselves, how small they learned to become in order to survive. The investigation into the building moved forward slowly, as these things always did. There were reports, reviews, revisions. Some people faced consequences, others didn't. The system adjusted just enough to say it had learned something without surrendering too much comfort. Isabella wasn't surprised. Real change, she had learned, rarely arrived all at once. It came in fragments, in resistance, in fatigue, in repetition, in the refusal to let a story be smoothed over or quietly forgotten. She stopped waiting for closure from institutions. Instead, she found it in smaller truths, in the knowledge that she had not turned away, in the understanding that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee protection, in the certainty that silence, once broken, is harder to restore. She no longer believed that racism only lived in extremes. She saw it in expectations, in tone, in whose discomfort was prioritized and whose was dismissed, in how easily compassion was labeled disruption when it came from the wrong person. And yet, despite everything, she did not become hardened. If anything, she became more deliberate, more aware of when to speak, more aware of when to stand, more aware of the cost and the necessity of both. The story of that day didn't belong to her alone anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever stood in the rain, waiting to be seen. Everyone who had followed the rules and still been pushed aside. Everyone who had been told, directly or indirectly, that their presence was inconvenient. Isabella understood now that injustice didn't survive because people were cruel. It survived because too many people believed it wasn't their responsibility. And that belief, quiet, reasonable, widely shared, was the most dangerous part of all. Isabella never returned to that building. Not because she was barred from it, but because she no longer needed to prove anything there. The glass doors still opened and closed every day, polished and efficient, welcoming people who believed the system worked because it worked for them. Meetings continued. Policies were updated. New language replaced old language. On the surface, it looked like progress. But Isabella had learned that progress without reflection is just movement. Her life didn't transform overnight. There was no sudden comfort, no dramatic reversal where everything she lost was returned in a cleaner, kinder form. What changed instead was quieter and far more permanent. She stopped shrinking. In conversations, she no longer softened her words to make others comfortable. She stopped apologizing before speaking. She stopped explaining herself in advance as if expecting resistance before it appeared. When something felt wrong, she named it, calmly, clearly, without asking permission. At first, it unsettled people. Some mistook her confidence for anger, others for defiance. A few tried to dismiss it as attitude. Isabella recognized those reactions instantly. She had seen them before, dressed up as professionalism, as concern, as just trying to help. But this time, she didn't absorb them. She understood now that being labeled difficult was often the price of refusing to be invisible. The woman in the wheelchair, Elena, wrote to her months later. A simple letter, careful handwriting, no grand declarations, just gratitude and something else that mattered more, recognition. She wrote about what it meant to be treated like a person again, about how that day had reminded her she was still visible to someone, about how systems, even those designed to protect, often forgot the humanity they claimed to serve. Isabella read the letter slowly, then folded it and kept it in a drawer, not as proof, as grounding, a reminder of why she had stepped outside in the first place. As time went on, Isabella noticed how often people around her hesitated when something felt wrong, waiting for someone else to intervene, waiting for authority, waiting for certainty, waiting for permission. She began to understand the real danger wasn't cruelty. It was delay. The pause where responsibility dissolved into diffusion. The moment when everyone assumed someone else would act. The space where harm could continue uninterrupted because it didn't appear urgent enough to disrupt comfort. Racism, she realized, often lived in that pause. It lived in policies that pretended neutrality while protecting familiarity, in systems that punished compassion when it came from the wrong place, the wrong person, the wrong uniform, in the quiet agreement to keep things moving rather than make things right. Isabella didn't become a symbol. She didn't want to be. She became something more difficult to ignore, a person who noticed and refused to look away. Her story circulated slowly, imperfectly. Sometimes it was misunderstood. Sometimes it was simplified into something easier to consume. But it endured because it wasn't about heroism. It was about choice. A single moment in the rain, where someone decided that rules were not more important than a life. And that choice, small, costly, uncelebrated at the time, changed the direction of everything that followed. Isabella understood now that injustice rarely announces itself as injustice. It arrives dressed as policy, as procedure, as professionalism. It speaks in calm voices and reasonable language. It insists that no one is to blame, that this is just how things are done. And that is why silence is so powerful. Because silence allows harm to sound like order. She often thought about how easily that day could have gone differently, how she could have looked away, how she could have finished her shift, kept her job, stayed dry, gone home unchanged, how the woman in the wheelchair would have waited, longer than she should have, until someone else decided she was worth noticing. That version of the day existed. It just didn't happen. And that, Isabella believed, was the point. Change doesn't begin with certainty. It begins with discomfort, with the refusal to accept that harm is normal just because it is common, with the courage to interrupt a system, knowing it may not protect you in return. By the time Isabella realized how deeply that moment had reshaped her, she no longer felt afraid of it. She felt responsible to it. Because once you see how injustice works, Once you recognize its quiet efficiency, you can never go back to pretending you don't notice. And neither can we. So the question this story leaves behind isn't whether Isabella did the right thing. It's this: how many moments like that pass us every day, moments where someone is waiting in the rain, while we decide whether it's our responsibility to stop. Because silence may feel safe, but it has never been neutral.